a professor in housing institutions and governance in the Faculty of Architecture in the Built Environment of Delft University. So I've done, some decades of research into housing, affordable housing, how to organize it. I have a position in Tongji University in Shanghai.
Oh, great.
So I already did quite a lot of research for the European Commission on affordable housing, how to organize it and how to connect it to societal needs. I teach undergraduates, graduates in Delft in architecture as well in technology, policy and management. So that's my background. And when you ask me where to go, then I have to share with you that I am leading a very nice initiative in our university called 1 Million Homes. So in the Netherlands, and I don't know, have you been to the Netherlands?
I have, yes. And I'll be sharing with the students a lot of pictures and maybe some videos of different parts of the Netherlands.
Yeah, it's a lovely country, and I think it has quite a reputation in urban planning and housing. Many students across the world come here to learn about what is the challenge in the Netherlands and what is the expertise we can learn from. And that triggered me, in particular when I'm teaching in Shanghai. So what is special about the Netherlands? And I am leading now an initiative in our faculty because we have a housing challenge in the Netherlands to learn. So what is our history and how did we survive neoliberalism, financialization in the last 3 decades? What can we learn from it? So that's my task in the Netherlands, together with architects, urban planners, building technology experts, science, finance. So I'm leading this initiative and we are quite sure that the Netherlands can solve the problem if they make a smart strategy, because we are a coalition society, we have a democracy, we make compromises. So we have a lot of compromising, a lot of complexity in the system that prevents us from finding the solution. And my ambition with my big team is to find an answer to the challenge, and that is by thinking about what is a sustainable and an inclusive society for the future. So a bit higher level than only thinking about what is a business model, but where do we want to be in 2070, 80 when it comes to inclusion and sustainability?
That's great. Would you say that the Netherlands has fared better in the last 3 decades in terms of kind of maintaining social housing than other countries in Northern Europe?
I would love to say yes, but I am not convinced. You know, we have a great tradition. I've been in many supervisory boards of social housing organizations, but I think the Netherlands also was part of neoliberalization, of financialization, about making. So we have a huge share of social housing in the market. 1/3 of the Dutch housing market is social.
Wow.
Social is owned by social housing organizations, but that does not mean that it is below market.
Right.
So within the social, the whole marketization took place and the rents go up, and even within social housing, many people live unaffordable.
And how, so in the 1/3 of the market that's social housing, is that divided up between cooperatives and publicly owned buildings, or tell me about that 1/3 of the market?
A very good question. It's not publicly owned, it's not cooperative, it is owned by private foundations that are registered on below of the Housing Act.
Okay.
So they are private with a social aim.
I see. And the social aim is
cooperative. It's not owned by a collective of people. It's not public. It's not owned by the government. It's owned by private companies, but these private companies, they are registered on the Housing Act, and they serve public aims.
And so our rent, one of the public aim, I imagine, is having low rents. Are the rents set by a government board, or how are the rents decided for those units?
It is not, the aim is not having low rents. The aim is serving particular target groups.
Okay. And so what, for example, what would be some examples of target groups?
Low income groups. So there is an income limit. I see. But the rents went up and up and up. So you must know we have private social housing organizations. They have not market rents, a bit below market rents, but creating affordability is done by a housing allowance scheme of the national government. I
see. And is everybody eligible for the housing allowance scheme, or that's depending on income?
It depends on income, yeah.
Okay. And so everybody within a certain, because in the US we have housing vouchers as well, but most people that are eligible for them because of low incomes do not receive them, simply because the government doesn't fund the program, to the task that it needs. Is that the case in the Netherlands, or is there everyone that is eligible can receive it?
That's very different in the Netherlands. I did a lot of research on the housing voucher scheme in the US, and in the Netherlands, everyone is eligible. But at the same time, the problem is that when, the economy goes down, then there is a pressure on the housing allowance budget.
I see. And so then new applicants can't receive the allowance.
They do receive, but then there is the pressure for the politicians to reduce the amount of housing allowance per month, for example.
Interesting. And so then in terms of the production of the social housing, is that done by these private companies then? And is that being built at a fairly rapid rate, or is it being built less frequently than market rate housing?
It is done by private foundations. So they have a non-profit aim. They build housing.
Right.
And in the last couple of years, they have restrictions. They have to pay a landlord levy, so they produce less.
I see. Yeah, because here it's basically constrained by the amount of public subsidy that exists for the nonprofit. Because here we also have nonprofit housing associations and for-profit ones that build affordable housing, but they're constrained by the level of subsidy. And I think in Holland, do these organizations also get land from the municipalities, like in Sweden?
That's a good question. They do qualify for low land prices in some municipalities and not in others. So it's up to the local level about the land price for social housing.
I see. And then there's this idea of universalism among social housing, at least in Sweden. I wonder in Holland, is there that same idea where the private rental sector and the social rental sector are seen as one rental sector and regulated in a similar way, or has that never been the case in the Netherlands?
It has been the case. I will send you an article written by Hans Lind and me about the ideas of universalism in Sweden, the Netherlands, and how it changed?
Yeah, I have seen that article. Yeah, that's why I was hoping you would just briefly describe it. I will assign it for the students to read as well.
Okay, I think that's worthwhile because it was the ideal model in the 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, but it was left behind. And I think in the Netherlands, in politics, from left to right, I think across the political spectrum, it was considered not future-proof. So we had a parliamentary inquiry in the Netherlands in 2013 to 14 that was questioning the whole social housing model in the Netherlands. There were some fraud, mismanagement cases. So that was a reason. And you must know in the Netherlands, this parliamentary inquiry is the highest instrument for parliament to ask critical questions about the system.
Right.
And that was the case in 2013-14 in the Netherlands. And then they asked the question, is there place for universalism or is it more a safety net? And the decision was the universalism belongs to the past. We need to concentrate on vulnerable groups. That's the future of social housing. But still, we have a huge sector. It's still 30% of the whole stock. So we are a bit universalistic in practice, but by ideals, we are safety net.
Interesting. I wonder about the idea, the idea of homeownership and versus renting. And I think that many countries like Germany, especially where it has such a high renting rate, I think it must have to do with the other parts of the social safety net and the welfare state being so strong. And I think that in places where there isn't a good pension system or there isn't a good social security system, then people see the need to invest in housing in order to have kind of something to some stability in retirement. I wonder
invest in homeownership, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. I wonder what you think about that and whether kind of how that plays out in the Netherlands.
A very good point. I think the whole quite generous welfare state in Europe is under pressure. And that means that also the identity of social housing and pension systems and home ownership is changing. So it used to be that pension systems were really stable, at least in the Netherlands, and it was not necessary to have your own house to build assets. So you could do with social rental house. And I think that's changing. I mean, it's not as in the US or in the UK. We are still in between.
Not as bad.
It's not my words. I mean, it's changing.
Right. But you definitely see, and you are a professor in China as well. And so you know about countries where the pension system is very limited. But, you think about, I work a lot in Latin America, and you see people, everyone that can invests in an empty lot at the edge of town or an additional apartment, just as kind of a security for retirement. So I think it does, my experience is that it does relate pretty strongly to savings, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I teach this in China, in Shanghai, they all say, well, we build assets because that's our pension. There's no secure pension system only for civil servants, but it's also under pressure. So people buy a house to have security for old age. So therefore, I think there is quite some realism in the observation of Esping Anderson and Francis Castles about the relation between welfare and home ownership.
Yes, indeed. I will be starting off the quarter with reading some comparative welfare state regime stuff. So I wonder about, this, the EU legislation, I didn't realize that the kind of creating the EU affected rental regulation in Europe. Can you tell me about how that changed, kind of how the Netherlands regulated rental housing?
I think it was rather the political situation in the Netherlands than the European legislation that changed the thinking about the system. I think this whole neoliberal thinking changed. And in fact, the Netherlands used Brussels and the European Commission to change the way of thinking about the unitary system. So the long-term ideal shared by social democrats, Christian democrats, was you have a broad rental sector as an alternative to home ownership, supported by a broad coalition. And that changed in the Netherlands, in particular by the liberal parties, the financial sector. They are really critical. They influence Brussels, and Brussels said the Netherlands that, well, you know, our universalistic model is very old-fashioned and should be changed. So it is the thinking about neoliberalism, finance that changed in the Netherlands as well as in Brussels. So the Dutch story is that it's Brussels who changed the sector, but I think it is the thinking across the continent in Europe and also in academia that caused this change in ending the ideal of a universalistic rental model.
That's very interesting. I guess so. I would love to hear your thoughts on the argument for maintaining the universalistic rental model. If you had been in the parliament debates in 2013, what would you have said? Or were you in those debates? I should ask that first.
I have been in these debates from an academic perspective. I'm not a politician. I'm not in parliament. So, yeah, that's a good question. I think the universalistic idea was really nice when it was supported by not only the social democrats, also Christian democrats, but now it seems to be a very old social democrat ideal, not supported by many. So I think I like the idea, but to my opinion, we need to think, and that is what I do with my new initiative about 1 million homes and a future of inclusive, sustainable housing for the future. So in my opinion, the old model of universalism has failed. No political support. I like the idea. I would love to defend, but you know, it's 2020. We have to think about the next decades. So what I'm looking for is a new idea of what is affordable, what is sustainable, and connecting, because the whole debate on social housing in the Netherlands is among policy experts, finance experts, and I try to make the link with the architects and the urban planners. So in our faculty, I make the link with design. So I'm thinking about design, and I think we as architects, urban planners, building technology experts making solutions for energy neutral circular building need to come up with sustainable ideas for the future. And social housing associations can help, but also new startups, new companies. So we need new thinking.
You know, I wonder how much immigration has shaped. I mean, so there's this story that people tell about the loss of support for universalistic type programs. And, you know, you hear this commonly in the US where people say, well, Northern Europe has a great welfare state model, but in the US, we have this diverse society and a lot of racism. And so people would never support it because they think somebody else is getting the benefit. Right. And so if they were thinking that it's their own group that's getting the benefits from the social housing or the welfare state, then it's okay. But when it's seen that a new group of people is getting those benefits, then that's when they start pushing back against it. I wonder how much you think that is part of what happened in the Netherlands versus the finance people taking over.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. And I think in the Netherlands, you know, we have the whole debate about populism, about immigration. a bit different from the US. I don't know to which extent you are familiar, but I think the idea of universalism lost support already in the previous century. And the whole debate about populism, immigration comes on top of that.
Right. That makes sense.
So that's only supporting the idea that it's old.
Yeah.
It is no more of these times. It's the welfare state that was from the previous century,
Right.
Lost.
The old, inefficient, kind of clunky welfare state.
Yeah, I teach in Shanghai, and then my students tell me, like, Europe is a very nice museum with very nice solidarity ideas.
Right.
So I always come back and think, yeah, in a certain sense, they are right.
I like this idea very much because I'm also thinking about kind of how California could develop a vision for growing the number of people that live here in a way that people are excited about rather than resistant to. Because in California, I think most people, especially voters and people with resources, are opposed to the idea of growth in the population here. They think California is full. So I think that articulating a vision for how to add more residents to the state is really important. But I wonder with a million homes type project, I'm going to ask my students to listen to this story about and correct me if I say it wrong, the Bijlmermeer housing development outside of Amsterdam. The Bijlmer?
The Bijlmer, yeah.
Bijlmer, yes. So I wonder, so that's I guess a classic story of modernist housing dreams
of the 60s, yes.
Didn't work out. So I wonder if you could, I'd be curious to see your thoughts on why that project didn't work out or whether it worked out or not, and kind of how the future growth of cities in the Netherlands can learn from that experience.
Yes. Yeah, I teach my students always about St. Louis, about Pruitt Igoe.
There's a lot to learn there as well. It's kind of similar in some ways, right?
Yeah, it's the ideas coming together of architects about urban design and the organization of public housing, social housing. And I think when it comes to St. Louis or the Bijlmer, I think many things coincided. The idea of modernism in design, as well as the idea of public housing. So why did Pruitt Igoe fail and the Bijlmer? It is maybe because of wrong assumptions of the designers, but I think also a bad coincidence with social economic changes that did not help. The loss, the white flight in St. Louis, people going to the suburbs, and in the Bijlmer, many people going to the suburbs, and Suriname became independent. So that was a colony of the Dutch in the Caribbean. They came into the Bijlmer, so it was a different Dutch population that came in there. So I think it was a coincidence of developments that resulted into a disaster.
And do you think it was also just the size of the project? I think that, smaller scale social housing projects could be more successful, but they cost more money. So there's this tension between cost and eventual success.
I think it was the underestimation of what social housing is. So it can be the size, and if you develop large size social housing, affordable housing, you need to be aware that if you build affordable housing for more vulnerable groups in society, that it requires thinking, management, and social order.